6 years ago, our next speaker finished a 5-year climate and energy project in China, analyzing the design of energy and climate change policy in this huge country and the domestic and global impacts of that policy. With that experience in mind, Valerie Karplus, who is an associate professor and running a laboratory for energy and organizations at an institute at Carnegie Mellon University in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, will now share her thoughts on the tension that often occurs between corporate efforts to address climate change through the value chain and the local and regional policy that they have to adapt to. How can this tension be reduced? I'm going to leave it to Valerie Karplus to elaborate. She's joining us live from Pennsylvania this morning. So good morning to you, Valerie. I hope you are well and ready to deliver your presentation. And to start that presentation, you're going to have a nice round of applause from our audience. Take it away.
And good afternoon to all of the distinguished delegates. I'm delighted to be here to share more about our experience, and by our, I mean a joint team together between Tsinghua University and colleagues here in the US, now here in Pittsburgh, in my newly established laboratory as of 2020, the Laboratory for Energy and Organizations. And so looking back, I've worked on China for around 20 years now. I was just counting and remarking at the incredible changes in that country's energy system over the years that I've had the pleasure of engaging with colleagues, mainly at Tsinghua University, but also at universities across the country. And through those experiences, I think you can really see how energy transition has taken root in the country as well as in specific regions. And so as I speak to the challenges that China faces, I'll take a differentiated view. We want to think about China both as a global energy superpower, a major carbon emitter and greenhouse gas emitter, but also as a very diverse place where some cities, particularly on the eastern coast, are a highly developed state and are surrounded by many contrasts, particularly in the middle and the western part of the country, where you have conditions that are closer to a developing country setting. And so I think we want to think about the challenges of energy governance given these huge contrasts between rural urban, between rich poor, and certainly with the diversity of backgrounds, experiences, and heritages that are represented within China's borders. If we look at the energy transition in China over the past 20 years or so, you can really see huge progress in the sense that the country has moved from relying on upwards of 75% of its primary energy mix from coal. That's dropped now to about 60%. You're seeing sort of progress in expanding renewable energy dramatically, exponential growth in both wind and solar generation, and of course, shift to cleaner forms of energy, natural gas, and a huge emphasis on energy efficiency through a number of government programs. Now, this ambition has not just come out of nowhere. It's come with a set of increasingly serious and binding climate policy targets. And those have largely built on a set of efforts to address both environmental and energy-related challenges in the country's energy system. So much of the progress that we've seen in recent years has actually worked hand in hand with efforts to address the country's severe air pollution crisis. And there has been progress on that crisis, as well as in addressing climate change. Now, in the fall of 2020, we heard Xi Jinping announce that the country was heading towards carbon neutrality in 2060. And this type of, this target sounds ambitious. It is ambitious. It builds on several pledges, past pledges, including the country's goal to peak emissions at latest by 2030, and to increase the share of non-fossil energy resources in the energy system to 20% by 2030. But getting to 2060, our research suggests, is going to take new institutions, and it's going to be very, very challenging. And when you advance the energy transition, both for economic and often for equity reasons, you really start with the low-hanging fruit. You try to take emissions reductions where it costs the least. In China, understanding where these are is still very much a work in progress, and how those deeper reductions can happen, particularly in the heavy industry sector and in the electric power sector, is underway. There have been significant advances in this direction. For example, the country has set up an emissions trading system right now for the focus is on the electric power system. The idea is to expand it to other heavy industry and energy commodities. And going forward, there is a significant push to continue to deploy renewables, in tandem with that, to liberalize the power sector and set up institutions and policies that can really help to advance the low carbon transition in the country. Now, one thing I wanted to come back to and highlight was the challenge that global corporations that operate in China can face when trying to transition their upstream Scope 3 emissions, which are associated with their supply bases in China, to cleaner forms of energy. So companies are making ever more ambitious pledges to reach net zero on a mid-century timeframe. And this can require that they need to influence parts of their supply chains and downstream users in ways that they didn't ever have to before. The challenge in the case of China is that and the reason why this is so important is that fully 15%, depending on how you calculate, 20% in that range of the country's total CO2 emissions are associated with production for export. So net exports from China's industries. And those emissions are a huge contributor to China's total domestic footprint. They're also companies are interested in addressing those emissions through their supply chains. So I think there is really an interesting opportunity now for these corporate and regional strategies to intersect. And while I think the details have yet to be worked out, these types of coordinating mechanisms and new institutions can really help to move work across organizational boundaries and influence the direction and purchasing procurement behaviors of supply bases, signaling to the power system that indeed they are ready for more clean sources of energy. Now, this government policy and corporate policy and supplier demand has to all work in tandem. And so this is, of course, a challenging proposition, but our research has highlighted a couple ways that this could become easier. The first is setting up and incentivizing companies across China, not just the largest enterprises, to audit and understand their greenhouse gas emissions and come up with plans for addressing those emissions, starting with those that are most directly associated with facilities, and then working their way to indirect and to upstream and downstream emissions for at the supplier level. And those suppliers then also, so we've learned that actually many companies that entered the pilot emissions trading systems took several years to be able to do this well, to report with high integrity, and it required supporting institutions like fourth-party verification of third-party auditors and sort of safeguards to make sure that there were, and what we found is actually that companies in the beginning just didn't really know how to report their emissions. Second challenge, I think, is in getting internal supplier practices to work together with national policies. And part of this is around encouraging businesses to and diffusing good management practices through organizations from the corporate side upstream to suppliers, and then at the same time having policies, the provincial and national levels, bear on those organizations, encouraging them to reduce their carbon dioxide and other greenhouse gas emissions. And so I think, just to wrap up, that there is great potential in these, if these overlaps can be harnessed and turned into opportunities to share the cost burden and, of course, the very due credit for solving these challenging collective action problems at the regional and local scales. With that, I'm going to conclude my remarks, but I'm happy to come back to any of these points and also talk broadly about China, the US, and global context in the discussion. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Valerie.